How does an export industry grow from 1% to 24% in 8 years? And how do you treble tourism revenues in 3 years? Now, former Soviet Republic Georgia may well have the answer. Joining us now from London to discuss applicability of the Georgian model in Africa is Charles Robertson. He's from Renaissance Capital, Managing Director and Global Chief Economist. A very good evening to you, Charles. That question, how does an economy move from export growth of about 1% to 24% in 8 years?
Well, what was so amazing about Georgia was that a new government came into power in 2003-04 and said, we're going to make it easier to do business. What they didn't say was what businesses would do well. They didn't know. They just said, let's make it simple. So car registration, for example, they made it 15 minutes to register a car. And they made it much easier to trade across borders. And then suddenly, Georgia, not suddenly, it's taken 8 years, but their biggest export sector now is the re-export of cars through the whole region. And that's gone from 1% of exports to 24%. They did something with visas as well. They said any country which is richer than us, richer than Georgia, can come and visit, and there's no visa requirement. There's not even a landing form. Tourism revenues have gone up 3 times in 2.5 years. It's incredible boom area, and it tells you that if you make it easier to do business, the private sector will create the jobs.
Well, Charles, it must have taken really a radical economic policy in the country in order to get the country to where it is right now.
It did, but the country was in a terrible state. Per capita GDP had fallen. It was the richest republic in the Soviet Union because they had so much agriculture. Everyone used to go on holiday there. By the 1990s, they fell into huge disarray, civil conflict. Corruption was so bad that the country was exporting electricity to Turkey and other countries when their own people were sitting in the dark. And this terrible mess meant that there was a revolution in 2003, and I think people were prepared to put up with some completely radical policies because of the pain that had happened before.
We had the the former Georgian premier is currently in Rwanda now, and we have seen some reforms taking place in Rwanda. We know that Rwanda was one of the best places to doing business in Africa in 2010. But when you look at this model, how far can it go in Rwanda?
Well, what they did in Rwanda, and it was partly influenced, but exactly as you say, by the reforms in Georgia. And this guy Lado came down and offered his advice and got involved with the Bank of Kigali in Rwanda. They cut the number of days to start a new business from 18 days to 3. Which is quicker than America, twice as quick as America. It's quicker than Western Europe. And 6,000 new companies got registered in Rwanda in 2011, and that was more than the previous 5 years put together. So suddenly you get a more formal economy. The government could start to tax that economy because they know who the companies are. That gives the government revenues to then build infrastructure, roads, roll out broadband to the right places because you know where the companies are. It's been an amazing story, and it is being replicated across Africa. I think a lot of governments are recognizing the advantages. They don't know which sectors will boom, but they know if they make it easier for the private sector, it will boom. Think of telecoms. 10 years ago, it was all state-owned telecoms companies, monopolies, and very bad policy. 1% of people in Nigeria had access to a phone line. And now 50, 60% coverage across the country through mobile phones. It's been an amazing transformation driven primarily by the private sector.
When you look at the African continent, like you say, it's taken, well, in Georgia, it's taken about 8 years. We had the Georgian Prime Minister making all those reforms in Georgia, taking him about 8 years. Would we be unfair to say that it should be taking Africa at that time as well to get their house in order?
I guess the advantage for Africa is that you've seen it work elsewhere. The example that Rwanda's showing is how quickly it can make a difference. Rwanda's been able to grow very strongly for a decade nearly on the back of these type of reforms without natural resources, no oil, no gas, no huge new mining projects from the Chinese, just getting reforms in place. So I think it can be done quicker, and some of the growth rates we're seeing in Africa are amazing. You know, the IMF, the top 3 fastest growing economies in the world this year, all in Africa. Gold, silver and bronze for Africa, according to the IMF in 2012.
But when you look at the African continent, it's not entirely homogeneous with colonial hangovers. But what do you think is the major handicap here?
I think it takes time to recognise what works. I think probably the more democratic countries are likely to react more to the pressures from their people. Pressures that might be for better education, but might also be to make the private sector better. So I think there can be constraints on the political side, but I think the lesson is getting learned, and that's one of the reasons why Sub-Sahara keeps on beating the rest of the world on growth, when 20 years ago it kept on coming in underneath the rest of the world on growth.